Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College, a program that encourages good discussion in our community on today's local and global issues. Now, your host for Conversations from St. Norbert College, author, professor, and nationally known sports economist, Dr. Kevin Quinn.
Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College. I'm Kevin Quinn. Our special guest is Gustav Niebuhr, and we will discuss religion in American life. Niebuhr is associate professor in religion and the media at Syracuse University. A journalist for over 20 years with the Washington Post, the New York Times, and other newspapers, he is a leading voice on religion in American public life. He is the author of Beyond Tolerance, Searching for Interfaith Understanding in America, which analyzes how religious communities in America reached out to the Muslims in their communities after the September 11th attacks. Gustav, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Delight to be here.
Well, you understand a lot about theology, and you come from a long line of theologians, but you didn't start off as a theologian.
No,
you studied history.
I did, as a matter of fact. Yeah, I have a BA and an MA in history, and it remains a fascination. And I think in some ways that led me into newspapers, too, because originally I was planning to become a political reporter. I'm glad I did not.
In this day and age, probably. But it's not like religion is without controversy in American life.
Oh, absolutely. That's religion does not lack for controversy at all, particularly within religious groups.
So you were at a couple of small newspapers in the 70s, and you wound up in New Orleans in the early 1980s, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right? Correct, yeah. I had 2 years in New Orleans, fascinating city. It's a place that one of these days I'll get back to. I still remain curious as to how the city has coped with the hurricane, Katrina.
You were covering general news there, or were you covering religion at the time?
No, that was before I got into covering religion, and I was still on my trajectory of wanting to cover politics. I was covering local politics, which was quite fascinating, but it was while I was in New Orleans that a friend of mine who had gone to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution called me up out of the blue and said, "You may be interested in this. They have created a job here. They want to put religion on the front page of the newspaper." Now, I hadn't thought about it, but then I began thinking about it, particularly after our phone conversation, and I thought that, gee, I wasn't reading enough serious religion stories as news. And I believed then, and I certainly believe now, that religion is an inescapable part of the American culture and a truly varied and diverse subject. It needs good, thorough, and nuanced coverage.
Well, when you were in Atlanta, you wrote about this in your book, that it was going from sort of a monoculture with respect to religion with Southern Baptist,
yes,
but there was an influx of Catholics and everything else. What was that like? I mean, that's kind of right in microcosm what's
yes, as a matter of fact, I remember it was one of those fun times when I could both surprise and inform my editors prior to being able to write about this for the readers. But I said, look, you may think of Atlanta as being a very traditional area of Southern Baptists and United Methodists, but in fact, the largest group that's growing here, or the third largest group, but it's growing most quickly, are Roman Catholics, coming in both from the north and also from Mexico and Central America. And there are also smaller communities here, Muslims for one, which completely surprised them. And I said, we've just got to expect that a city like this, that has so much economic opportunity in the late 1980s, is going to diversify. It's simply going to benefit from all kinds of immigration, both within the country and from outside of the country. And that is going to change the religious nature of Atlanta. Those changes have been replicated in many cities and suburbs and in rural areas across the United States as people have either moved around or have moved to the United States.
So what does a religious editor or religious reporter do? I mean, it's not like you're listening to the police scanner waiting for a faith emergency or anything like that. How do you go about finding stories?
The best way to find stories is to talk to people. And what I saw my mission as being was becoming as familiar as I could with people who were well-versed in different traditions. And some of those people were clergy, some of them were academics, some of them were simply prominent lay people, some of them were business people who simply were well connected with the different communities. Getting to know those communities getting to know what the issues were in those communities. And in all of this, there were trend stories, there were stories about, there were profile stories, there were feature stories, just ways of illuminating who was there, what they were thinking, how they were acting, whether they were involved in controversy within their own community, which often meant that there was a change going on. I really saw my role as informative and educational in that sense. I was bringing to light, I hoped, communities and their concerns in a way that hadn't quite been done before.
Are there any stories that you remember in particular as being poignant or something that really touched you in some way? Big stories, little stories?
Yeah, well, the big story, the story that occupied me throughout the time that I was in Atlanta was the what we called the Southern Baptist Civil War. And that was a power struggle that went on within the Southern Baptist Convention, 16 million members, largest Protestant denomination in America, in which there was a real battle for control between people who tended to be kind of traditional moderates and had a particular view of what it was to be a Baptist in America, and a much more conservative wing, which was more interested, particularly at that time, I think, in public policy, in what influence they could bring to bear to sort of shape public policy in America and American culture. This coincided with similar, I think, fissures within the Republican Party, and were somewhat related to it. I met any number of fascinating people on both sides. I saw people triumph, I saw people hurt.
Well, in the 1980s, of course, it seems that that was the rise politically of fundamentalist Protestantism in American politics.
Yes.
That the Republican Party had sort of kept that wing at bay, and it wasn't as important a part as it became later. But with Ronald Reagan and the moral majority, I mean, that was right then that all that stuff was going on.
Yeah, and it was absolutely fascinating too, Kevin. You could see the shift that was happening. I mean, because every few months, someone would rise to prominence, someone would create an alliance. There were these religious sort of political alliances that were developing between people in the Republican Party, regional, state Republican Party, and people within evangelical Protestant circles, particularly, as you say, fundamentalist circles. And it did shift the politics in the region. Now, one of the key players, and you mentioned him obliquely, was the Reverend Jerry Falwell, who died a couple of years ago. He was a fundamentalist Baptist and a very charismatic figure, somebody who commanded a real following through his television broadcasts, through his books, his writings, and through his very, very significant church and university in Virginia. He was a very public figure. He was someone who was available to the press. I got a chance to interview him many times, and through him get sort of insights into what was happening in this sort of religious political movement.
Well, that schism that you mentioned in the 1980s, I understand in the Lutheran community here, which is big in Wisconsin, they've had similar issues. I think some of the fault lines are homosexual marriage and homosexual ministers.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things happening now among Catholicism is there is a group among American Catholics that would be happier with a smaller Catholic church that's pure.
Yes.
And which you talk a little bit about that in your various writings. That fundamentalism. What's your take on that?
Well, the question is what happens is there enough of a constituency for sort of a big tent? And here I am borrowing a political expression, but where people can agree perhaps on who they are as in terms of the broad identity, but disagree on certain things that are not absolutely crucial in terms of the theology. And that's a point of real tension in the United States. The Southern Baptists, particularly their very conservative wing, decided that there could not be a big tent and that the institutions needed to be run by the very conservative wing, and they succeeded in doing so. Among the Lutherans, one of the big changes, I think, came perhaps even before the Southern Baptists, when the Missouri Synod underwent its change. And again, you had a very, very conservative group essentially taking power, and more moderate people either staying or deciding to leave and help form a new denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Within Roman Catholicism, yes, there's been a lot of talk, particularly, I guess, since the death of Pope John Paul II, about would those who wanted a sort of a smaller, purer church have an ally in Pope Benedict XVI. I'm not sure they do. I think that Cardinal Ratzinger and Pope Benedict XVI are two rather different men, and there's something about becoming Pope that may, in fact, change your public expression in some ways. He's not turned out to be quite the very conservative Pope that people expected.
He certainly had that track record, and that was
Yeah.
some concern among more liberal Catholics that would be the case. In my own lifetime, I think one of the most interesting things that's happened in religion has been the, I guess, the rise of Islam.
Yes.
In the U.S.
Yes.
When I was a kid, 1960s and 1970s, it was a very exotic thing. It was in the Middle East, and
Yep.
we read stories about 1,000 years ago, etc. But it was certainly not real and nearby.
Yes.
And what do you think were the forces that led to the rapid rate of increase of American Muslims?
Well, there's a signal date in all this, and that's, and I think we're at what would this be, about the 46th anniversary of the signing of a sweeping revision of American immigration laws that Lyndon Johnson did in late October 1965 at the base of the Statue of Liberty. It was a law, a revision that had been passed by Congress to change immigration laws which had been in place since 1924, which really had cut off substantial immigration to the United States except from Anglo-Saxon areas of the world. And one of the things that Congress did was it listened to business, to major employers who said, look, if we're going to compete, we're going to need a lot of brains, and those brains are not all in the United States. We should be essentially a nation open to talent. So the quotas, the restrictions were changed significantly to allow people from the developing world to come to the United States, people who already had high degrees, engineers, doctors, accountants, people like that, and also people who wanted to study in those fields in the United States. So to make a kind of a long answer to your short question, what happened is a great many people from South Asia in particular, and from East Asia, took advantage of and have continued to take advantage of those changes in immigration law, moved to the United States, came as younger people, got married, had children, moved to the suburbs, and thought, gee, we've got to provide religious education for our children. We also have to have a place to worship, built mosques, built Buddhist temples, built Hindu temples, and literally changed the American religious landscape in the 80s and the 90s and the last decade, and continue to do so. So these days, the largest of those groups is Muslim. We have 4 to 6 million, maybe more, American Muslims. And I should say up front, not all of them are immigrants, because another thing that happened was a significant stream of native-born African Americans who had joined a black nationalist sect called Nation of Islam. I know this gets kind of confusing. Converted to Orthodox Islam under their then leader in around 1980, late 70s, early 80s, and became just part of the Islamic world. So about a quarter of American Muslims are black. Their roots go back generations in the United States. So it's this mix we have here in this country, a real ethnic mix, not unlike what Roman Catholicism was, say, in the late 19th century and what it's become again, you know, the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
Well, you know, when I think about that, and you think about Cassius Clay,
yes,
and Lou Alcindor, I mean, as I think most white Americans maybe came into contact with Islam in some way.
Yes,
that way, these guys took on funny names and they're doing strange things, I think, is sort of the way that most people thought about it. Throughout the 1970s, of course, maybe there was a growing identification, unfortunately, with Islam and terrorism, which, of course, I don't know if you want to call it the high water mark, the low water mark was September 11th.
That's right. Yeah, and it's something that it's something that's absolutely undeniable that there's a small but dangerous splinter of thinking in the Muslim majority world, which sees itself in a very aggressive posture toward the West and also toward governments in the Middle East that they consider to be either too secular or too favorable toward the West. Now, a lot of this thinking comes out of certain philosophers in the Muslim majority world who rejected capitalism and rejected socialism as paths forward for, and rejected ethnocentrism as paths forward for people in Muslim majority countries. And as those ideologies were discredited among this group, they turned naturally to a radical form of Islam. However, I think we have to realize that there are about 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, and we're talking about a real narrow band that are not representative of Muslim tradition or certainly not the Muslim majority. And I want to say too that they certainly didn't invent terror. When I was growing up, terrorism tended to be political, and it was there were groups called the Red Brigades in Italy and the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany and the Red Army faction in Japan, and you know, those were political terrorists. But these days, and particularly since the rise of Al-Qaeda, terrorism tends to be associated with these criminal gangs that call themselves Muslims.
And of course, you know, one of the things that President Bush emphasized, I think, quite wisely, right after the September 11th attacks, was not to go and burn the local mosque.
Yes,
and,
absolutely.
I mean, he's been criticized for a lot of things, but I think perhaps he deserves a little more credit for making sure that that was not what wound up happening. Well, he wrote a whole book about America's reaction to this. Tell us about what motivated your angle on the book and what you found in the process of writing it.
Sure, yeah. Well, in the 1990s, I was a reporter covering religion for the New York Times, and as the decade wore on, I began to realize that there was a story out there because I kept encountering some of the figures in it, and that was the story of a completely decentralized, completely grassroots movement of individuals who favored dialogue across religious lines as a way to foster peace and understanding. In other words, it's the exact opposite. It's the counter trend to religious violence, and it got a big boost with 9/11. Counterintuitively, it's simply because people realized, I think at that moment, that if religion could be used in such violent ways, the best way to try to step in and preserve civil society and, you know, head off mayhem would be to foster conversations and cooperative work that led to the busting of stereotypes and took down suspicions. It's really a kind of a remarkable thing because it was done at the local level. The question is, though, how do you tell the story as a journalist, a daily journalist? How do you tell a story like that in 1,000 words or 1,200 words? Couldn't do it. I would have had to have gone to my editors and said, you know, I've got this great story. It's about people talking to each other. And not only that, it needed more than 1,000 words or 1,200 words. And so at the end of 2001, I left the Times. I began research on this and eventually wound up traveling the country, talking to people and trying to get insights and examples of this, and found that there was much more there than I could actually do. So I tried to select from some of the best situations. What I found were, like a mosque and a synagogue collaborating together with people who were in a regular discussion group. What I found were, for example, an organization in Syracuse entirely of women of all different traditions meeting and talking with each other about religious, about family matters, and in the process raising money to build a girls' school in Pakistan. I found very, very serious conversations going on in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles between Roman Catholics and Buddhists that were kind of theologically oriented. And then I found some things that were like one-day events in which people would simply come in from a neighborhood to a house of worship and just listen to different representatives talk about their different faiths. I sat in on one of these at a Buddhist temple in North Hollywood, California, and there's just all this different conversation going on and taking place. Nobody was organizing it above the local level.
Wow, and that's sort of not the message that you would get just watching the news, et cetera. I mean, it was all about the strife between the various organized religions, et cetera. So that's, I mean, I found the book to be very positive and uplifting as a result of that.
People have said that. I simply went out to tell a story, to develop a narrative, and I'm glad if it does give some people hope. Actually, I came out of it feeling hopeful. I came to think of it as sort of like the environmental movement if there weren't large organizations like, say, the Sierra Club or the Wilderness Society, because almost everything in this interfaith stream or movement is at the local level.
Interesting. You're watching Conversations from St. Norbert College. Our guest today is Gustav Niebuhr, and we're discussing religion in American life. And I'd like to talk a little bit about some perhaps other religions besides sort of the big three.
Yep.
And I'm not even sure if some of these are religions, but 25, 30 years ago, parapsychology and the occult was big, and maybe that's turned itself into New Ageism and Wiccan and that sort of thing. The military is now recognizing Wiccan burials, and that's almost unimaginable, considering that it wasn't, it wasn't forever ago that we were burning witches here.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'd be glad to. There is a very diverse stream of kind of new religion that calls itself a revival of old religion. It goes under the name of paganism. And the mainstream of that is Wicca, which is modern-day witchcraft. It doesn't date back that far in its present form. Just back to the 1950s in Britain, was exported to the United States. But it's very much a going concern, and there are organizations on various college campuses, within the military, and elsewhere, which self-identify as Wiccan or pagan, and what they tend to be. People who've never heard of this get very nervous and say, well, don't they worship the devil? Well, and they always say, no, we don't worship the devil. And it tends to be much more a revival of a kind of a Celtic type understanding of the way the year works, so the celebration of ancient holidays such as the one that would coincide with Halloween, the one that would coincide with Candlemas on the 2nd of February, the one that, May Day. They tend to be very sort of environmentally conscious people. They tend to be very gender equal in terms of who gets to have some kind of role, and also in the way that they look at the spiritual universe. Usually there's a male figure, God figure, and a goddess figure. It's quite fascinating, and it's all over the internet, which will put you in touch with communities and bookstores and things like that all over the country. For the most part, that's what it is. It's something new, and but it's attracted a lot of younger practitioners. It's probably more female than male, based on my observations. And you're right. You're absolutely right. The military has had to recognize it, and has for some years, simply because they get people joining the military who self-identify as pagan or Wiccan. One of the things I should say is that if you want to encounter diversity, the military is a great way of encountering diversity, because they take a lot of people from many, many different backgrounds, ethnic, racial, geographic, and religious. And because of the religious diversity, they really have to be defenders of First Amendment rights, speech, and free conscience.
They've had some issues with that, though. There have been some accusations that the more fundamentalist Protestant religions have co-opted certain elements of it, from what I understand.
Well, it's not surprising that that the chaplaincy corps within the military would certainly attract its share of evangelicals, and it's evangelicals are a very, very diverse group in and of themselves. We represent about 25% of the country's population, about the same proportion as Roman Catholics, and it's a challenge for some, you know, to essentially to coexist, at least, without wanting to convert people. But that if you do that and you come up against people with an established religious tradition, there's going to be controversy.
They get their backs up about
yes,
that.
Indeed, yeah.
But, you know, we're sort of in an interesting time in American history in that something that a lot of people thought could never happen, the election of a black president,
yes,
has happened.
It has.
And, but yet, you know, that would have been thought of as sort of the breakwater moment. But, you know, how about a Mormon president, or a Jewish president, or a Wiccan president, or an atheistic president? I mean, yeah. Is America ready for any of those just yet?
We're about to find out, I suppose, in some ways, in terms of a Mormon president. We've got two candidates who are seeking the Republican nomination, both former governors, Mitt Romney and John Huntsman. Romney from Massachusetts, Huntsman from Utah, both very articulate and very bright. I want to say businessmen in a way, and politicians as well. It's going to be interesting to see. Mormonism is unquestionably a very, very important American tradition and an important religious identity in the United States. What Mormons will tell you is that they're certainly Christian. Indeed, in Mormon belief, they are restored Christianity. Now, how that will go over when it is more fully aired, say if Mitt Romney becomes the Republican nominee, is something of a question. I think the acceptance of Mormons in the United States is much higher than it ever has been. But I think the great question is, within the Republican Party, where you've got a very large constituency of evangelical Protestants, whether they're willing to accept someone with real theological differences like that, it's really up in the air. I don't know.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, which has been a fascinating discussion. But thanks for being our guest today. I hope you've enjoyed our show. Until next time, I'm Kevin Quinn. Best wishes for good conversations from St. Norbert College.